Sophie was 5 years old when she was referred, together with her family, to me by her family doctor. She had been sexually abused by her uncle. I met Sophie and her family in the waiting room, and this meeting is the starting point for this paper on the person of the therapist in family therapy practice. So this paper is about the person of the therapist in family therapy practice. And the background for this paper, in fact, is the literature on outcome of psychotherapy. And this literature shows that first, there is, of course, psychotherapy works, and we have a lot of research that shows that it works. But we know now also that the psychotherapist is an important factor in the effectiveness of therapy. A second point is that we also know from research that not every therapist is as effective as the next one. So some therapists are very consistently very effective, and other therapists are less effective. A third finding in the literature is that some kinds of training may make a difference in the effectiveness of therapists. And more in particular, it's about trainings that are focused on the skills and the possibilities of therapists to form complex alliances, therapeutic alliances with families or with clients. In this paper, we focus on the person of the therapist, and this is not something new. In fact, there is a long tradition, a rich tradition in family therapy about thinking about the person of the therapist. And for instance, to just name one important author, Harry Aponte has a lot of publications on the person of the therapist, and has a great model, the person of the therapist training model, a great model to deal with the person of the therapist. What's typical for this kind of approach of the person of the therapist is that it's a kind of a historical perspective. And it's a perspective that's based on the wounded healer metaphor. So in fact what happens is, if you adopt this metaphor, you look at the therapist in action, and you notice that this therapist sometimes gets stuck in a kind of impasses. And you see that there is a pattern there. It's very often that the therapist gets stuck in the same kind of impasses. And then you take a retrospective view and you look at the history of the therapist. And you wonder what in the development of this therapist can help us understand what happens there in practice. What in the family of origin of this therapist can help us understand what happens there in practice. And also, you ask the question, what in the history of this therapist can help this therapist to become a more effective therapist in this session or the next session, and so on. So you try to find resources for this therapist, for him or her to be more effective in the future. My paper will adopt another perspective, so not an historical perspective, but more a perspective focused on the present moment of the session. So what I try to do in this paper is try to understand the psychology of the therapist in the present moment of the session. And in order to do that, I will look at dual process models from cognitive psychology. And in cognitive psychology, there are several dual process models. They're quite similar, but the best well known probably is Daniel Kahneman's model. And he makes a distinction between system 1, which is a system of the fast thinking, and cognitive system 2, which is a system of slow thinking. And the system of fast thinking, that's the system that's more active when the person is in a situation that where you have to do something immediately in the present moment. Now you have to do something. You don't have time to explicitly think. System 2 needs more time. this is a system that becomes active when there is more time to really reflect on things and also to follow certain procedures to find answers to questions, to find solutions to problems. So you follow step-by-step procedures in order to come up with an answer. And a person who's acting in a situation uses these two cognitive systems to steer his or her behavior. And the two systems, these two cognitive systems are always present. Usually one of the systems is more active and the other is more in the background, but it could be that there is something is happening that makes the second system become more active in the actual situation. When we use these dual process models as a frame to look at the person of the therapist in a family therapy practice, we can say that also the person of the therapist has, as it were, two systems. You have the system one, what Kahneman calls system one. This is the therapist who's immersed in the session, who's really part of you could say about a part of a therapeutic system. There's not so much difference between the therapist and the family. They are responsive to each other, and the therapist acts in the moment without too much reflection. In fact, the therapist acts quite intuitively. That's system one. System two is a system that's also present, but that becomes more active when there's more time to reflect. And the therapist sometimes takes some mental distance to really reflect, when the therapist has some mental space to really reflect on what's going on, and is this what I want this therapy to be, and is this the direction I want to take, and is this the way we are going to reach our goal, and so on. So the therapist uses the cognitive system 2 to evaluate the therapeutic process, to think about possible alternatives for the way that things are going. And the actual behavior of the therapist in the session emerges as a kind of an echo out of the way these two cognitive systems are balancing each other. When we use these dual process models as a frame to look at the person of the therapist, then we become able to formulate very interesting and important questions about family therapy practice, and especially about the complex therapeutic alliance in family therapy, but also about training and about supervision. And I think it's very important to really reflect on answers to these questions, because if we find the right answers to these questions, probably we can help young trainees, young family therapists to become more effective in the future.